Good morning, everybody. Well, good morning. It is my honor to introduce our speaker today for Grand Rounds. I met Dr. Telem when I was a fellow at Stony Brook, where she was my assistant program director. She has an amazing story to tell of what she's done in Michigan. But briefly, where she started was actually just up the road at Jefferson, before she was at Mount Sinai for residency and at Massachusetts General for fellowship. She is MIS-trained bariatric foregut and hernia. She did her master's in public health at Columbia, which she was completing when I was working with her. And she is now division chief at Michigan and VP of Quality and Patient Safety. And she is a clinical researcher, academic surgeon to the max. I am proud to serve alongside her at different organizations such as SAGES and the Foundation for Surgical Fellowship. She is definitely a role model for me, and I am very thankful to call her my friend. So please welcome Dr. Telem.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here today. Nothing makes me happier than seeing mentees, particularly those as talented as Dr. Halbert, thrive, and she has nothing but such wonderful things to say about everybody here. It was also nice getting to know some of you at dinner last night and getting to be here in your environment. So I'm here today to talk about a topic that's not often talked about in various types of grand rounds. And these are my disclosures, none of which are going to impact the talk today, but I do have some disclaimers before we start. One, some of this might make you uncomfortable. Some of you might already be sitting in this audience thinking, like, why are we here, and why are we doing this, and why are we talking about this? Does this really belong in a surgical grand rounds? But I want to say I have a lot of gratitude if you're thinking that, but you're here anyway to listen, because that tells me that you have an open mind. And that's all that we can ask from anybody today, is to have an open mind and to challenge your own thought process as we go through this. Two, I am not perfect. We are not perfect at Michigan. But we're having these conversations, and that's the point of being here today, is to have these conversations and to start. And three, I am totally Michigan biased, and I have to, put that out as a disclaimer. I heard some Ohio State fans in the audience. Is that true? You don't want to raise your hands, do you? That's okay. We have a big game coming up next week. I will be there. We will see what happens, and I'm pretty sure your money's safe, but you never know. So I want to start this talk by everybody sort of reading this. This is called A Surgeon's Dilemma, and think to yourself for a few seconds about what the answer to this is. When you're done reading it, because I tend to read too fast, please raise your hand so I can figure out when people have really read through. My fast readers. Getting to a critical mass. Okay. Does anybody get it? Who is it? Okay, so it's the mom, right? And the reason why I put this up is most people have seen this by now and know it's the mom, but when you present this, over half of people don't get this. And I put it up there for two reasons. One, I think that it's interesting that the universal example for implicit bias involves surgery, which I'm not sure what that says about our profession. And two, the first time I read this riddle, I didn't get it. I sat there for like 10, 15 minutes, reading it. And then all of a sudden I got to the end and I said, you know what? It's 2019. I totally get this. The boy has two dads. And I really thought that I had solved this problem. And it turns out that I was totally wrong. And so it brings me to this point, which is that even me, who's up here talking to you, has bias. We are all unconscious, and we are all a bit biased, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But we have to recognize these biases. We have to increase our awareness so that we can change our behaviors, so that we can improve culture, so that we can make sure that we're being the best us that we can be, and that we're taking the best care of patients that we can take care of. Because at the end of the day, when you ask yourself, how do we improve quality, and this is something that I think about a lot, we talk a lot about fixing patients, prehabilitating them. We talk a lot about changing techniques and doing optimal techniques. But what we don't talk enough about is how the culture that we create and how the culture that we are a part of impacts those things. And that's why we're here today. It's not about bias. It's not about finger pointing. It's about how do we build an optimal culture. And it's not easy because if you think about the way that we evolved, we weren't evolved into this thriving mode, into all these areas. We were really in a eat, run, hit, sleep, hunt, right? That was all that we started doing. And over time, as we got smarter and our brains got bigger, we started being able to do more things. But if you think about it, early man and woman didn't have time to sit there and think, is this a safe alligator? Is it a nice alligator? Did it eat already? Is it still hungry? You had to make an instantaneous decision based on cues about whether or not this was safe or unsafe, right? Am I going to die or not die? Is this food or not food? Because if you spend all that time processing, you are not going to move forward. And if you think about that, we receive about 11 million bits of information every single moment, but we can only consciously process 40 bits. And because of that, we're wired to see patterns. And what I want everybody to think about is, how did you get to work today? Did you think about every single step? Could you imagine what your life would be like if you're like, I need to open my eyes. Now that my eyes are open, I need to move my right hand, and my right foot needs to move outside my bed, right? Everything is sort of on autopilot so that we can function and just tune our attention to what really matters. The issue becomes that a lot of these patterns are shaped by our past experiences and who we are, what we view as safe versus unsafe. And when we take these shortcuts because we have to, because otherwise we can't function, that can lead to different misinterpretations. And so what I want to do is show right now a couple pictures, and I don't want to embarrass anybody, I don't want to say anything, but I just want you to think, as you see this picture, what is your gut reaction? What do you think this person does for a living? You don't have to call anything out, it's okay. How about now? Same person, different reaction? What about now? What do you think she does? How about now? Anybody's first gut reaction is, that's a neurosurgeon? Probably not, right? And so we have to constantly challenge ourselves when we see things that sort of trigger us to really understand why we're feeling that way. Because what we're really geared to do is recognize gender, social, and other characteristics to instantaneously judge people. Are they like us? Are they safe? Or are they not like us and potentially a threat and scary? And that's what we're dealing with all day long. It's not because people are bad people. It's not because people have bad intentions. It's because this is what we're wired to do. But the issue becomes that this really has a cumulative impact over time, because really even small amounts of bias can have really, really big consequences. So I like to show this slide, which is a computer simulation for hierarchy of promotion. So what they did is they created this simulation that was evenly split between men and women. And men and women were assigned random performance scores, with men given a 1-point advantage. So men could have a score from 1 to 101, whereas women's scores could only go to a max of 100. And so with 20 simulations with this 1% edge, look what happens at the highest level of employment, right? The people who reach that top tier, the women were significantly disadvantaged in terms of 35% versus 65%. And that was with a 1-point advantage. And so my question is, does this look familiar? This is the current state across academic medicine. If you look at our AAMC data that's comparing 5-year trends in academic advancement for women, what you can see is really marginal improvement. And a lot of people argue, oh, this is something called demographic inertia, which is just the time lag until women in the workforce achieve higher levels. But what I'll argue with you is that we've had near equal complements of women in the workforce for the last 15 to 20 years. And what you're seeing here is a drop-off, and a steep drop-off. And as we keep going up to these higher levels, there's less and less and less, and the rate of growth is not proportionate to our workforce. And this is even more pronounced for women of all underrepresented minorities, and particularly women of underrepresented minorities. And so it's not a pipeline problem, right? And this is data specific to surgery. The other one was across the board for medical care. And you can see that by the time you get to full professor, less than 10% of full professors are women. And if we go at this current rate and think of this in terms of that demographic inertia argument, it will take nearly 100 years before there's parity in rank between men and women in surgery. And think about that. That's like your children's children or children's children's children probably, by the time they get to be surgical residents, will hopefully have equity. We can't do that, right? It's 2019. That's not where we're supposed to be. And so the question is, why does this happen? And I'm talking a lot about implicit bias, but I do want to spend a second talking about explicit bias because it does still exist. I think it is not tolerated anymore when it's seen, and we've done a really good job of policing that and guarding that, but that can happen. I think you see a lot of that coming out now with a lot of the Me Too movement and Time's Up healthcare. That's not going to be the focus of today's talk because I think that's a whole separate talk and issue, but it does still exist. But there's also implicit bias that kind of look around mentorship and sponsorship, work-life integration, different economic opportunities, and gender norm expectations. So in talking about explicit and implicit bias, have people heard of these resume studies? Anybody? Okay, a couple people. So basically, a lot of these studies were studies where they had the same resume, and what they did was just change the name on the residency. So one was looking for a lab assistant, and it was the same residency. One had a male name and one had a female name, and that was the only difference. Male applicants from those resumes were rated more capable and actually started at higher salaries despite having the same CV. They also did this with people with ethnic names, so people who had what would sound like white Anglo-Saxon names versus names that would define them from a different ethnic community or underrepresented minority. They had to have, I think, 4 times as many applications sent to receive a phone call than somebody with an Anglo-Saxon name just based on resumes alone. And then parental status, they did this again where they put something on a resume for a man and women just looking at parental status or indicating something PTO. And what they found was that it was beneficial for men. So men had something indicating that they were a parent or president of the PTO was viewed as very favorable, versus for women it was not viewed as very favorable, probably from all the stigma associated with, oh, you're going to have babies and kind of go off into the sunset. So talk about inequity in academic opportunity. When you look at NIH funding, and this data are a little bit older, of 2016, but another study was published which showed essentially the same thing, which is women are less likely to receive funding. There's increased disparities in minorities, so black men, black women, and Hispanic men and women still fare worse than white women, and white men do the best, and then decreased percent of funding dollars as compared to men. And the big awards are typically go to men and very few actually go to women. Here's my funding grant that we put in. It was really interesting. We put in this R01 kind of trying to tease out workforce diversity and figuring out various interventions. As everybody in polarizing in America, it could be one gave all 1s, which is like a really great score, and another person gave all 6s, which is a really bad score. And essentially that reviewer went through and said that because of an increasing emphasis in diversity and inclusiveness, this problem solved. This is a reviewer at the NIH. And I was like, thank you for this review, because I will use it on every slide from now on and, and here for after. But there is a perception out there that we have to combat, that just because we have these efforts that has translated to parallel success for people, and that's not necessarily true if we're not working at it intentionally. There's also inequity in mentorship and sponsorship. So when they look at dyads, men, women, it's really interesting that women with women mentors actually fare the worst across the board in terms of self-reported experiences for sponsorship, which is really important, right? These invitations to serve as oral discussants in national meetings, on national committees, to write an editorial, to serve on an editorial board. That's what gets you promoted. That's what gets you to that full professorship. And what you can see is inequity amongst pairs. And this will become more important when we talk a little bit later about strategies and how to adjudicate and mitigate these things, and especially when we talk about mentorship and sponsorship. There's inequity in work-life integration. I don't like to say work-life balance. There's no such thing. We all try to juggle a lot of pots. We all try to integrate a lot of things. But if you look, women on average spend 8 more hours a week on household duties than men. That's a whole day, right? So that's like a whole day of time that can't be used. And that's a lot of time, especially if you're thinking about time set aside to write papers or market or advertise or whatever it is that you're passionate about. And gender role expectations. Men are expected to be assertive, independent, ambitious, self-confident, and have traits of aggression. What does that sound like? Is that like the job posting for a surgeon? Right? Like, what did they do for residency? I want a assertive, independent, ambitious, self-confident person. Women are expected to be caring, warm, compassionate, nurturing, sensitive, and communal. Does that sound like a surgeon? How many women have been called assertive in this room or aggressive? Nobody? Oh, there you go. Thank you. Is that a good thing? Has that worked out well? No, it does not. And so we have these issues that we associate traits with people, and then when you cross those lines or you act one way, you kind of get punished for it. So it's always this fine balance of having to toe a line and being perceived as aggressive and assertive, which is what you want and what's demanded, but also violates your gender norm schema and is a problem. And we see this also with pay gaps. We know women are paid less than men. Physicians and surgeons are worse, and loaded language. And this has become a big topic over the past couple years, which is the language that we use in our letters of recommendation, the language that we use in people's evaluations, the language we use when we write letters of support for grants, typically will be very different between men and women. Men will be rising stars and leaders. Women will be communal and nice to work with. Who would you hire? Rising star or the person who's fun to work with? And again, it's not intentional. It's just our biases and the lens that we bring to things. And the question is why does this matter? Why is a surgeon sitting up here and talking about issues of social justice? And the argument is this isn't, I mean, it's always an issue of social justice, but it's not just an issue of social justice. It's so much more, because all of these things impact the way we care for patients and their outcomes. It impacts our ability to do fair research and innovation, which is equitable amongst sexes. It impacts our ability to deliver healthcare policy and create healthcare policy. If the people writing your policy don't look like the stakeholders who you are delivering that policy to, there are really big problems that ensue. Anybody try to do an OR revamp and not include the front desk people and the people in the OR in that revamp, and all of a sudden you get all these like really smart 30,000 foot things that you're like, none of this will work down here because no one talked to us? That doesn't happen here, just where I am, right? So when you don't talk to people and you don't include them and you don't have people that represent, you get a lot of good ideas and theories, but the implementation often suffers. And this is a big thing right now, which is understanding policy implementation and actually grading it like you would any type of patient outcomes. And personal wellness, this takes a toll. My really close friend and collaborator, Maggie Hickens, studies this thing called vigilance, which is sort of what you wear to work on a daily basis. And she studied this actually in Black communities where there was a fair amount of fear kind of going out and worrying about what the perception in the world was. And it showed it was associated with higher rates of high blood pressure and different types of cardiac disease from the social stressors of being worried. And I would argue with you that anybody in this room who was worried about what they put on today before they showed up to work, who worry about their behaviors as they walk down a hall, worrying how people are going to judge them, who are going to worry how people perceive them, if you don't think that that takes a personal toll on yourself, that's a really, that you got to take a better look. Who worried about what they wore today and how that would be perceived? Anybody wake up this morning and worry? When you go to a conference, is somebody going to judge you? Is your skirt long enough? Is it not? You know, and all these different things. Imagine the amount of time that you would have freed up if you didn't need to worry about these things, right? If you could just like go to work and not worry about it. I'll tell you one story, which was an eye-opening story for me. We had this incredible Black medical student, and he was interested in surgery, and he decided not to go into surgery. And I said, why aren't you going into surgery? And he goes, well, everybody told me that I need to be assertive and I need to be aggressive. And I said, more assertive in all my evaluations. And I said, oh, why is that? He goes, Dana, I can't be assertive. I can't be aggressive because in my community I've been taught not to do that. And that stopped me and it floored me because I'm like, we are telling people to be aggressive and assertive and not understanding the different lenses and communities where they come from, where aggressive and assertive in that community might get you shot and killed. And it was a very eye-opening experience to me, and it's completely changed the language that I use when I encourage people to go into surgery. And in terms of healthcare, I just want to tell this story, which is cardiac disease, which really isn't a surgical disease, but think about this, right? In 1991, John Ianian, who actually heads our Institute for Health Policy and Innovation, published a paper in New England Journal of Medicine showing differences in the use of procedures between women and men hospitalized for coronary heart disease, showing that women were disadvantaged and fared worse. You know what? It's 2018 and it's 2019, and women are still dying from cardiac disease because all of the research in the NIH up until a certain point were done on white men. And how do white men present with heart attacks? Crushing substernal chest pain, radiating down the arm, going to the jaw. How do women present? sometimes breast pain, sometimes nausea, sometimes abdominal pain, and they get sent home with hysteria, anxiety, and all sorts of other diagnoses, and it's often missed. And this was just in Scientific America in 2018. And then there was another study showing out that women treated by women doctors were less likely to have an adverse event, less likely to die, and more likely to have it picked up if they're having a cardiac event because that woman was attuned to it. So think about that. It's 2019. We've known this for so long. And to the NIH's credit, they've now started using what's called sex as a biological variable, which is all studies have to include women and men to see differences in treatment options between the two sexes. That said, for a long period of time, all the data we have, even on things like hernia, are all white men. Is that really generalizable? Are we making generalizable recommendations? And I think that becomes very problematic as we think about and as we care for patients and as we bring our own lenses to caring for patients, because we might not recognize subtle nuances that likely make a great deal and send people home with having heart attacks with, Ativan, which happens over and over and over again. So we have to think about this in the context of what our medical education has been to date and how we want that to look in the future. Because diversity is a competitive advantage. If anybody hasn't read this book, I would honestly recommend you doing so. It's by Scott Page, and he makes a mathematical argument. So those of you who are math nerds like myself, lots of equations, very exciting. Much more readable than his first book, which was all equations and probably a long plane ride. This is a short plane ride. But if you look over time, when you have a diverse team, and I'm not even talking about gender, race, ethnicity, we're talking about cognitive diversity, the different lenses people brings, you're going to increase your innovation, you're going to outperform other teams that aren't as diverse because you're going to have multiple lenses thinking on the same problem, and you're going to ability to improve your complex solving. You want people there who don't agree with you. I want people in this room who don't agree with me, because if you can have a rational conversation and have productive conflict, the end product is always so much better than when you have groupthink. And so now that I spent all this time depressing everybody and talking about all the bad things, I want to end this talk talking about different strategies and ways we can think about improving this, and what are some things that we can take away and talk about, whether or not you can integrate into your program or not. The way that I think about culture change in this problem is the same way I approach any clinical problem that I'm setting out to do research on. I'm a health services researcher. I focus on something called implementation science, which is the question of who needs to do what differently and why, and how can you create sustainable change. When I look at that in clinical practice, whether it's hernia disease or bariatric surgery, that's a gap. That gap needs to be closed. We have evidence-based practices. We need people to follow. I view culture change, gender equity, issues of workforce diversity in the same lens. I look at that as a gap. We have a gap. We have to close. How can we figure out sustainable ways that we can implement to close that gap? And that's my challenge to every single person in this room, because each one of you are researchers, and whether it's for a paper or just on the local environment and something that you can fix, think about this as a gap. Think of this not as a social problem, but something that you can fix on your local level. And the first thing you have to do is kind of look in your backyard. You have to figure out what you're doing well and what you're not doing well. We just published this in JAMA Open, which was essentially a qualitative interview of 26 women who were still at or left the University of Michigan, asking barriers and facilitators to their advancement. And then we published it. We took all our dirty laundry and published it for the world to see. And everybody called our chair. They're like, do you really want that published? And he goes, of course we do. We want everybody to know what we're doing, and what we're doing that's really good and what we're doing that's not so good. And the most interesting thing to me personally that came out of this research was that it wasn't personal life. It wasn't these things at home that we often attribute to women as barriers. There were in-place organizational barriers that were rated to be the highest reason that women didn't progress or decided to leave. It wasn't what we typically think, oh, they had a kid and they want to go part-time, or, oh, these different things happen. But there were structural issues within our department that was disincentivizing and disenfranchising women. And it was very eye-opening and very helpful in terms of thinking about the various things that we needed to decide. So what I want to do, talk about a little bit now, are what are our best practices? What are our evidence-based best practices that we can achieve a culture of gender equity? And I think these fall under three domains. One is recruitment and retention. If you can't get people through the door and you can't retain them, then you're not going to have a culture that's different. promotion and advancement. When those people come in, if you can't promote them and get them through the system and get them into leadership roles or develop them into whatever phenotype that they would like to be, however that looks, that's not going to be great. And you can't do any of that without mentorship and sponsorship. So I want to spend the last few minutes talking about these domains. So recruitment. Based on this, we totally changed how we recruit at Michigan. We follow now the Rooney Rule. I'm not sure if people are familiar with this. I was not familiar with this. But essentially, the Pittsburgh Steelers owner and chairman in 2003 noticed that despite African Americans being a predominant amount of the players in the NFL, when you looked at higher levels, coaching, C-suite type people, there was zero underrepresented minorities. So made a rule in 2003 that said every single team with a head coach vacancy must interview at least one underrepresented minority. And that was not to give them the job, but it was to expand the applicant pool, to make sure that they're not overlooking any candidate just based on their own biases. And this expanded in 2009. Now, this has been a little bit controversial in terms of has it helped, has it not helped, but it was really adopted across the business sector too, and industry as a best practice. So that's what we do now at the University of Michigan. There's no more you call up, you call your friend, how you traditionally get, new faculty. Hey, I've got a spot, who do you have? Because when you do that and you call the same people, you get the same people. For every single one of our listings right now, they'll go public. We put them in very visible places. We put them on the American Women Surgeons website. We put them on SBAS. We put them on the Society of Asian Surgeons. We put them everywhere that everybody can see it. Before any single one of our positions close, we have to interview a woman and an underrepresented minority. And again, not to give people jobs, but to make sure that we're not overlooking people and we're not recruiting different phenotypes. When you come into our institution, this is what you see. This is our recruitment committee. There's about 15 of us sitting around a table, and you. And everybody gets asked the same set of standardized questions, of which there are behavioral questions at the end. And in that room, sitting there, are different people across specialties, across ages, across ranks. We have residents in there, and every single person is listening to the same answers. And you would be surprised hearing the same answers, how much controversy and argument over what was heard is actually done. At the end of this, we rank the candidates, and we give our chair the ranking. And that can get contentious because sometimes we don't like the people that people brought in who they wanted to hire. And that's happened a couple times. And when you do something like this, you really have to have buy-in from leadership, because the first time this process fails and you say you don't want somebody, but they hire them anyway, that's the last time you're going to get engagement or think that you're going to actually make active change. This is Erica Newman. She's a pediatric surgeon at the University of Michigan. This was her brainchild. This is something that she has run, and I can tell you she has gone toe-to-toe with our chair and various section heads, and she's been backed up, and this process works, and that's why we donate about a full day sometimes, like 6 times a month, to come here and interview all of these candidates. And at first, we thought people were going to think this was scary and run back and go from Michigan and be like, oh my God, this was like a horrible experience. But it turns out, for the most part, people really liked this, and they really felt very happy that they had what they felt was a fair opportunity, that they knew everybody was going through the same thing. Because I think we all worry the same thing, that is the job really open? Is there shenanigans in the background? Is there already, an internal candidate? And this has really leveled our playing field. Promotion and advancement. I encourage every single one of you, including residents, think about this. When you show up in your institution, it is on you. It is your responsibility. Learn what your promotion guidelines are. People can help you shepherd through. People can mentor you. They can sponsor you. But if you don't know what you need to do to get where you want to go, it's going to be a real problem. And there's some level of inertia you need to sort of overcome to get there. The biggest thing, and I think I was talking to Caitlin about this last night, and the most transformational thing for me is having a peer mentor group. I think we often think of mentorship as vertical. As you start coming up, and also at any stage, it's also horizontal. And that horizontal mentorship is actually, in my opinion, sometimes the most valuable, and we'll talk about why in a second. Create transparent systems for positions, committees, and honors. Think about how, when you have different committees that you have an opportunity to serve on, how is that selected? Is it democratic? Are people invited to apply? When you're making decisions for the residents about who's going to be doing what and who's going where, are those processes transparent, where even if somebody doesn't get it, they don't feel it was due to nepotism, but more due to objective criteria? The more objective you can be with criteria, the better. And then hold leadership accountable. Every single person in this room is empowered to hold people accountable. Every single one of you is empowered if you see something happening, if you see something going on with one of your residents to say something. And I think that's the most powerful. And where we see this the most is with residents when they're rounding. Oftentimes you'll have an aggressive patient or a patient that's showing hostility towards a doctor, and having a chief resident that just says that's not okay sometimes goes a really long way for not just that, but to feel supported and to know that your resident has your back and the people have your back and that you're not going to allow people to treat you that way. So in terms of peer mentoring across the continuum, these are the different things I think it can do for your early career, help you learn the ropes a little bit, help you define your professional role, what do you guys want to be when you grow up, work-life balance, integration, gaining visibility and preparing for advancement. As you get to mid-career, which is a little bit where I am now, it helps with networking, maintaining your visibility, leading a team, mentoring others, reassessment and redirection of career. Am I doing the right thing? What do you guys think? Is this good? But later in career, especially as you kind of get more senior and there's less senior people to mentor you down, it's really a great way to maintain knowledge, consulting, expertise, preparing for retirement, and figuring out various problems that may only apply to you. And this is our story of peer mentorship, which is these women are my peer mentors. When I showed up at Michigan, I was going into my 4th year of practice. Yeah, that's about right, because it was right after year. Going into my 4th year of practice, and we had a big efflux of all of our mid and senior level women. So I showed up, and they're like, "You're mid-career." I'm like, "Great." You know, I was like, I'm not really mid-career, but this is what we're doing. And so there was a couple of women who were still in the same position that I was. Jen Walgy, who I heard Chad Brummett and Mike Englesby came down and talked to you. She's kind of the third rung on the thing. She helps run Michigan Open, who I know you guys heard a lot about, the opioid prescribing network. Erica Newman, who I just showed you. Gurjeet Sandhu, who's actually a PhD in education. Leslie Dossett up front, who's a surgical oncologist, and Don Coleman, who's a vascular surgeon. So really 6 women who have no business being together. We don't do any of the same operations. We don't take care of any of the same patients. But we all had the same thing, which is now all of a sudden we were all very early on in our careers, and now we're mid-career, and we got to do something about this. And so many of us have research skills, and this is what we wanted to do. So we came together and we said, instead of just talking about this problem, we need to do something about this. And how do we do something about this? And we decided that we were going to start trying to study this in a rigorous evidence-based way so we can help develop best practices, but more importantly, that we were going to help disseminate that information and also create leadership opportunities for where we felt the biggest gap was that early to mid-career shift, that early to mid-career change where we start seeing drop-off from the assistant to associate professor and people aren't going forward because something is happening there. And through that, we created our collaborative, which does research, some of the stuff that I've shown you and looking through, but we've also created a meeting, which is a little bit different. This year, it's directed at kind of early to mid-career. This year, we're doing something a little different, continuing to push the envelope, where the whole first day of the meeting is actually going to be dedicated to segregation in healthcare, and we have Rhea Boyd, who's a pediatrician and just a phenomenal speaker in this space, coming to give a keynote and kind of talking about a lot of the different things we don't talk enough about, which is patient-facing bias. When patients don't like you because of your gender or underrepresented minority, how do you handle that? How do you do that? How, if you're a bystander to that, what you do? And trying to address some of these issues that constantly come up and really impact the wellness of our institution, but we don't talk about enough. And finally, mentorship and sponsorship, and I'm going to argue this comes in many forms. No one person is going to be your mentor. No one person is going to be your sponsor. You need a team. You need a roster of people that you can go to for various reasons, for various issues, because no one person can be everything to anybody. And this comes at a cost because there's a lot of contemporary issues right now. There's generational issues between millennials and boomers. There's a lot of sometimes hostility. You'll be in your clinic and you see somebody on your phone and you're rolling your eyes. You're like, why are they on their phone? I can't believe they're not paying attention to patient care. Well, you know, turns out they actually are. They're looking up information because that's how people consume information these days, but it's not how I consumed or other people consumed information. And so there's a lot of sometimes friction that can come between generations that can impact ability because of perceptions for mentorship. There's forced concordant mentorship pairs, right? You show up and everybody's like, here's your mentor. Mentorship's organic, and then you're with somebody. They're always like, you're a woman, she's a woman, you should totally mentor her. I'm like, but she's a basic scientist, and I know nothing about basic science, and, you know, I can help with some things, but I don't know what PCR is anymore or, like, Western blots. I can't do this. And we also saw, if you remember that other slide that I showed you, when you do that and you force these dyads, you're actually disenfranchising people because they're not going to perform as well, especially if you give people persons who aren't in their area of expertise. And finally, the mentoring in the Me Too era. And this, again, is an uncomfortable thing to talk about, but I have been told repeatedly by both men and women that men, because of a lot of the things that are going on right now, are refusing to mentor women, and that they're just refusing to do it. Now, if you think about the slide that I showed you and you think about being disenfranchised, if you now have the majority or the people who are really in these high-level positions, many of whom are now refusing to mentor women because of perceived issues, you can only imagine that that achievement gap is going to widen. And so we have to figure this out. We have to figure out what to do, because some people are like, I can't believe that, but I can tell you, women-facing and men-facing, I have even young men are like, oh my God, the men in my institution just won't mentor women anymore because they're so worried. I have personal feelings about that, but that's irrelevant here. You know, what's relevant is if this is the perception and this is the problem, then we need to have this conversation to talk about it, because otherwise we're going to make change. So how do we move forward together? I think the first thing you do is you question your assumptions. If you have someone on your team, you don't like them, or you don't think they're good, or you think there's an issue, ask yourself why. What's that based on? What are your objective metrics? What are you judging that on? Rigorously assess whether you create an inclusive culture. If you're rounding, whether you're the chief resident, a mid-level, and attending on the service, are you giving credit to those around you? Are you listening? Do your actions reflect your beliefs? You know, modeling and role modeling and acting, saying one thing means nothing as if you don't walk the walk. So you really have to be very introspective. If you say, I want to build an inclusive community, and then you're screaming at people in the OR, you're making your team feel uncomfortable, or you're like only helping some of the residents but not all of them, you can say all the things you want, but the actions speak louder than words. And finally, do you listen? And this is something I had to overcome because, you know, being from the Northeast and a Philly girl and a New Yorker, like I talk a lot, and, you know, we all talk a lot. But when I say do you listen, I don't mean do you listen waiting to talk, right? Because that's what most of us do. We just want to get what we say. But are you really listening when people are telling you things? Are you actually processing what they're saying and their lived experience? And I'll tell you, when I started doing that really intentionally, I learned lots of things that I don't do anymore that I didn't think were a big deal, but it turns out that they were. Practical strategies, how can we do this better? Think about meeting times and venues if you're really worried about Me Too issues, and perhaps meeting in a bar for drinks is not the place to do it. Also, some people come from families with alcohol abuse or have had histories of substance abuse, or religions which don't permit for alcohol use. So having meetings solely in a bar, that doesn't mean you can't have a drink with your mentor or mentee. I have drinks with them all the time. But creating variable opportunities is really key here so that you make sure you can be inclusive. Making sure they're not kind of gender specific. I always get one woman in the audience who's like, but I love golf. I'm like, that's awesome, but over a population, most women don't love golf. So if all your strategizing is in the club room or on the golf course, and you're with your like 4 or 5 male partners, and that's who's giving you your network, and that's who's making you your recommendations, you can pretty much be assured that what your leadership team is and what your team is going to look like is the same people. And also timing. Having 6 a.m. meetings and 7 p.m. meetings is really tough in general for people with families, but moreover for wellness. So try to figure out how you can do it during the day and make a decision, either early morning or evening, but not both, because you can't flank people's day like that. People need to be human beings and go home. Intentionality, you want a diverse team of mentors. Again, that's Jen Walgie, that's Tan Wang, who's one of our amazing residents. What we do at Michigan is when you come in, you are onboarded as a new faculty with what we call a launch team. That team is made up of 5 or 6 other faculty members that represent your clinical interest, your research interest, and your overall interest. That way you give them people initially a network for success and to hold you accountable. We meet 3 to 4 times a year to make sure that people are tracking out for promotion. Our residents, like all residents, no offense, we're like, we want that too. So we're like, of course you can have that too. So now when our residents come out on their academic development time, they get a launch team to make sure that they're using their academic development time. And now our mid-career was like, we want that too. So we're creating what's called boost teams. So people for their mid-career who are looking and aspiring for upper-level leadership will get a boost to help them go along, particularly at that assistant to associate or associate to full professor transition. This has been remarkable. It's been really great. Not every mentor can make every meeting, but at least you get enough there that you have to hold accountable. One of my faculty mentees showed up, and he's supposed to be writing a K award, and he'll kill me if I tell the story, but it's okay. But he comes up with this list of paper of all the things he's doing. And I was like, this looks so great. I go, but you know what this says? I circled the whole area. I'm like, this says that you're not paying attention to what you want to do. And I'm like, while this is all awesome, this is your focus. And we refocused him. And you know what? He had an Ames page to review like 3 weeks later. And so I think it's helpful because we're all a little bit like squirrel, like something shiny new, but to keep people on track to make sure that they're working towards their promotion, having a group of people to look at that has been great. And finally, adjudication. What happens when things goes wrong? You can build the best culture in the entire world, but if you're not prepared to handle bad things or difficult things or situations when they happen, that culture will fall apart. And I don't think we know the best way to do this yet. We know that right now we're doing a study looking at women who've been written up and trying to figure out, but what we do know is that when people get written up or feel that they've been treated unfairly and it's not handled and adjudicated properly, it leads to burnout, issues with wellness, issues with patient safety and care. And so this is really a work in progress, and we don't know how to do this well yet, but I think this is an area we really need to think about, because if we can't handle difficult situations in a way that's fair to both parties, both the accused, the accuser, whoever that is, whatever the issue that comes up, you'll never build an inclusive culture. And finally, accountability. Everybody is accountable. You got to question your first impressions, justify your decisions, ask for and be receptive to feedback. Feedback is a gift. It honestly is, negative and positive. If you have a fixed mindset and you don't listen to it, you're not going to grow. Every time somebody's telling you something, it's not a personal attack. It's just to help you make better. And once you view it like that, and you view it as like that type of gift, I think it makes everybody better. And empower everyone around you to call out bias and enact change. This isn't just from leadership. Every single person in this room is a leader. You lead every single day. You lead your teams as you round. You lead patient care. You lead every single domain. So this is really on every single person's plate. This is our Michigan promise. This is our Advancing Surgical Excellence. This is the promise that we make to all faculty in our division, that we are going to develop them in the phenotype that they would like to be developed in. This is a 6-pronged strategy where most of what I talked about falls in, focusing on our environment, achievement, leadership, recruitment, innovation, and outreach. And how are we doing in those strategies that we talked about? You know what? We've diversified our candidate pool. We've hired people that traditionally would not have come to Michigan, not just by race and ethnicity or gender, but also by phenotype. We have people who want to do. It used to be the phenotype for success at Michigan was a basic science researcher. Now our phenotype for success is global health, it's education research, it's translational research, it's health services research, it's all sorts of different things, it's clinical leadership. And it's been really great getting all these different people with different viewpoints. We've all gone through implicit bias training, although I have some reservations about that because training without intentionality really kind of works. And mentorship and sponsorship, so far these launch teams have been really great. We've also set up these faculty exchange programs where our young faculty go to different places around the country to practice grand rounds, and some mid-career sabbaticals for mid-career folks who want to do new things. So people are liking this. We're pretty early on. We have about 6 to 8 months worth of data, so more to come. Again, this is a work in progress, but we're trying. And so some take-home thoughts for everybody in the room to sort of think about is when you have applicants who apply here who are similar on paper, how do you decide between them? What are your objective criteria? Is it fit? Because we were doing that, and we have to stop doing that because we were getting kind of the same people over and over. Does your messaging encourage diverse applicants to apply and select your organization? What does your website look like? Who's on your website? Who's representing your department? Does it look like an equitable place? And when you do have leadership or other positions or committee positions that arise, how do you nominate for that? How do you make sure that you're looking for all of the candidates that could potentially fill that void? Not just the people who self-nominate, because we all know that men tend to self-nominate more than women, but that doesn't mean that one is more or less qualified. So really thinking about where is the intentionality is as we promote people through the system. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions and entertain discussion.
Dana, that was amazing. Thank you very much for making the trip down here and leaving your beautiful family to join us this morning. And I think that gives us a lot to talk about. I think that we are working on changes, working to improve what we're doing here, but there is so much still to do. Can I ask any questions from the audience? We have our representatives from our provider well-being department here with us today, and it's really nice to see that group here today because it's something that they have really challenged within our organization and are doing an amazing job to improve here. So just want to say thank you for coming today. Any questions we have? Dr. Rubino, he's our program director for our residency program.
Thank you for an excellent and thought-provoking talk. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or recommendations on how we approach the idea of diversity and inclusion within the match system for residents.
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question and something that we're working on right now. In terms of our match system, we're in Michigan, so there's a certain population that wants to come to Michigan. It's not as sort of attractive at the coast. It's people who want to go there for specific things. What we're thinking about in terms of our applicant pool is how do we standardize that so people aren't getting different questions in different rooms, which might advantage them or disadvantage them, and should we be applying the same principles that we apply to faculty recruitment in terms of standard behavior-based questions where everybody's judged? Should we be doing panel interviews for things like that? So we're just sort of starting there. I think on a local level, having a set of questions that are standardized across applicants is one way to objectively measure how they answer those questions is important. I think sometimes also the lens of who's interviewing them. So doing group interviews, not 20, but 2 or 3 people in the room, hearing some of the same things so that they can pick up different aspects. And then when you're in that ranking meeting, and there's always, first 10 are always like really clear, but when, 10 through 30 is always a shuffle and bringing people up and down, figuring out how do you really do that, and are you being intentional about creating the diversity that you want to see in there. I know there are some programs, because we know historically that underrepresented minorities don't fare as well in some of the standardized testing, just because there's inherent bias in those exams, that are saying, okay, we're just going to lower the test scores for everybody, understanding that we want to get a bigger pool and we want to get a bigger encapsulation. And I think that that's great also, because I'm a firm believer that a standardized test says nothing about you unless you can pass or fail it. But I think it's just figuring out how you can capture a bigger pool so you have more people to interview, so you can change, or not change, or just making sure that you're getting the best of the best everywhere.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ben Goff. I'm one of the 4th-year residents. Thank you very much for coming down. I really enjoyed it. Talking about implicit and explicit bias, so I'm a DO in an ACGME program, and now it's the end of that 5-year GME merger right now. How do you feel, especially an institution like Michigan? I didn't even bother applying because they'd never taken a DO in their surgery program. And, Dr. Halbert obviously went to Stony Brook, and she's a DO, but is there still bias, you think, between MDs and DOs? Do you think it's decreasing, gone away, or what's your take on that?
Oh, I think there's bias in everything that we do, and I think I do think probably it's still harder depending on what your medical degree is, because people have that lens, and that should change. But I don't think it stops there. I think there's bias as you progress through medical school and through residency also. How many women decide, I want to be a breast surgeon, and they're told, but you're technically good. Why? Because you can't have a technically amazing breast surgeon who wants to take great care of patients. When you tell someone you want to go into MIS, and they're like, you don't want to do hepatobiliary or vascular. We do a lot of shaming based on our own lens. I think we put a lot of undue pressure on person, on people. And what I tell people is, I think it's getting better, but I think you have to have a voice. And I think, like any underrepresented group, what you have to do, unfortunately, in the beginning is just be amazing and be the best doctor that you can be, so you change people's perceptions, because once you get a critical mass, that's when you get movement. But I also think we have to be careful how we talk and how we distinguish. And I get really upset about this in Michigan all the time, and how we talk to our residents, because somehow if you're not a transplant or pancreatic surgeon, like, your life has no meaning, and people, are meant to feel like, somehow they've done something wrong. And I think that that's completely wrong and leads to poor wellness, because at the end of the day, 80 hours a week is 80 hours a week, and you have to be happy with your choices. So I applaud you for asking that question, and I think it's great that you asked, and I think you should keep asking that question. And if someone doesn't give you an interview, ask why, and figure out, is this really this? Is there something on my application that can be better? And just keep being the best you that you can be.
I think it brings up a good point because, something that I've obviously asked many times before, and I think that kind of lends into the imposter syndrome in me. When I went to Stony Brook, and I was like, how did this DO from a community program in Delaware end up at Stony Brook? And I really felt like an imposter there until I did the work and was rewarded for it. But it was. But it still carries on, and I think that implicit bias will kind of lead to more and more of that imposter syndrome until we really fight that.
And what also happens is when you do get a leadership position now, sometimes they'll be like, oh, they're just giving things to women now, or they're just giving things to underrepresented minorities, like somehow you didn't earn it. And so there's that additional barrier to overcome where you almost have to prove like every time I walk into a room, people don't look at me as like, that's our vice chair of quality, that's our division chief. They're like, oh, so every time I walk into a room, I feel like I constantly have to reprove myself and that like I deserve to lead that room. And there's data to show that. I'll walk into a patient room with like my male medical student who's taller than me, and they'll deflect to him, and he'll be like, I don't know, he's like talk to her. But little things like that you have to constantly, reaffirm your position and what you're doing. And the hope is by talking about this and changing overall what we look like from every domain. And again, I look at gender and race ethnicity as such low-level diversity. You're really talking cognitive diversity across the board that my hope is for our kids we're not going to have these conversations, but, we'll get there, I hope.
Nate Merriman, one of the GI physicians at Christiana. Thank you for the talk. It was phenomenal.
Oh, thank you.
And you made several comments that I really am going to take away. One was bias is everywhere, and that's seemingly getting even more profound with AI and how bias is now entering into algorithms. Mm-hmm. I was also curious about whether you guys at Michigan are working on teaching all of us, all your Michigan team members, where our bias is. And are you doing that at scale? Are you doing that in small pockets? Because I think that is really helpful to self-reflect and understand, okay, I'm biased. I went here for residency. I went here for medical school. I went here for college. I have these background experiences that influence my decisions moving forward. So I was wondering if you guys are doing any of that.
Yeah, we've done implicit bias training. There are these implicit association tests that sometimes people take, and they'll show you kind of where your biases are. A lot of that's also been debunked, and they're not quite sure how good they are. But it's hard to change an individual. I mean, you can be reflective and you can try, but all of us are human. So what we've tried to do is put in structural and organizational barriers to help that, to kind of overcome people's initial or implicit bias. So we put in barriers so we can't hire people that look like us just without people talking about. We put in barriers so we can't just mentor and sponsor sort of that same group of people and making sure that they're getting, like everybody coming in, getting equal access to people. So while I think it's really important to have implicit bias training and to be aware of our biases, I think it's even more important to make sure that you have objective, structural, organizational aspects that help us overcome these things when we don't recognize it, because we won't recognize it and all the time, myself included.
Hi, Dr. Telem. Thank you very much. Just excellent talk. I just wish somebody had been around having this discussion 40 years ago. And it makes me a little sad that 40 years later, much of it has not changed. So thank you for what you're doing now.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. I think there's a bunch of people who are working on this. And I think I was just telling your new diversity and inclusivity officer in the hospital that one of the things that happened when I hit mid-career and I've had my whatever the normal academic achievements are is you get this opportunity where you can make a decision about what your platforms are and what you want to do. And if you ask me what I do, I'm an implementation science. I study practice gaps. I study hernia specifically and understanding how to give value-based care and prevent low-value surgery, and that's probably what I'm known for my clinical practice, but then became very passionate about this as a practice gap because, I felt that perhaps, and I think this was my lens because I think the way that I am is I don't I try not to see barriers. If there's walls, I try to figure out how to go through them or around them. So I'm really good at shuffling out signal from noise. And I probably experienced this a lot, but just didn't recognize it because I was just very laser focused on what I wanted to do. But in hearing people's different experiences and thinking back and realizing that not everybody can do that and that this does have a horrible impact on people's wellness, on people's ability to move forward, and seeing the objective data, the numbers, sometimes you use your platform to talk about things, and that was how this decision came about, to even be here talking about a subject that is a little bit outside of my normal sort of wheelhouse of things that I do, but it seems to be the most impactful, and if it helps anybody in this room, it makes me happy. So
we have we just talked about mentorship with our residents, and I have charged them with finding a mentor and working through that relationship and building that relationship. And not many of them have gotten back to me. And I think a lot of it is this is the first time they've had to go find a mentor, and with our support, of course, to find those mentors. And some of them come back and say, well, I don't know who to talk to, but more importantly, it's, I don't know, I want to find somebody in the specialty. I'm not sure what specialty I want to be in. And so I try to encourage them to think outside the box. Is there any advice that you would give our residents as they start to develop these relationships in their life?
So it's a great question. It's a whole other slide deck of talk. And how do you identify a mentor and things of that nature? I think finding a mentor is a really hard thing to do. And I think about my own experience. I don't think I actually had proper mentorship until I was actually at the faculty level, which I think just not disenfranchised me, but it would have helped me tremendously. And I look at our residents and the opportunities that they have, and some people are more proactive than others. It's super awkward walking up to somebody and being like, oh, will you mentor me? It's just weird, and it's uncomfortable. And I think what you want to do is you want to look at that person and see, do they have a track record of mentorship? What's their track record of success? If you go to somebody and you want them to mentor you, but they've never mentored anybody, or the people they've mentored hate them and they've taken all their ideas and stuff, probably not the person that you want to see. But then there's always the go-to people who are so overextended who can't mentor you properly. So what I would say is kind of like speed dating, try it out. Identify 3 or 4 different people that have interests similar to you. So if you decide you want to be an MIS surgeon, find somebody in the GI department who does maybe flexible endoscopy, find a bariatric or an MIS surgeon. If you want to do research, find a researcher. If you want to go into private practice, maybe find somebody in the business administration office and figure out marketing and developing. But find a diverse group of people that you can go to, because someone's going to click and something's going to click. So it's just a lot of trial and error. But don't build a person. Don't be reliant on a person, because if and when that relationship goes sour, then what are you going to kind of have? Find a team, find a network, and support each other. You guys are your best. Peer mentoring is one of the best forms of mentoring.
A quick question. When you showed those data about the women mentoring women being the worst pairing, worst success, what can we as senior women do to make that not true in our own case? How can we as women do a better job at mentoring other women, and what do you see are the main reasons for that?
So these data are from Reshma Jaxi, who's a powerhouse in this field. She's one of the people who started Time's Up and Me Too. We're just lucky enough for her to be a collaborator in Michigan. And what she did was follow KO8 recipients over time. So she looked at them at 2 time points to see sort of what happened to them. The hope is that now there are more women in leadership positions than there were perhaps 10 years ago, right? We have chairs of surgery, we have people who are division chiefs and section heads, and people who have a little bit more clout. And what we have to do is just make sure that when we decide to mentor and sponsor somebody, that we really are mentoring and sponsoring them. And that doesn't mean we do only women. If you look at my mentees, for instance, half are men, half are women, and I push people through whatever I can do for any of them. But I think this will hopefully change as more women go into leadership positions, but it's also our responsibility to make sure that we're being thoughtful when we're recommending people for positions and for opportunities, men and women.
I think that concludes our time this morning. I want to thank Dr. Telem again for her talk this morning. I think it was an excellent overview of what we can look for doing here in the future at Christiana. So thank you very much.
Yes. Oh, thank you. I'm glad I didn't I'm glad the talks were different. I didn't have to hear the both.
It's really great. I'm glad our residents got to hear their faculty on the case. I tried to elbow my way into the last night.
Yeah, but then we're working on behavior discussions. We don't really know what to do with it. On a national perspective, and it's still variability in how people ask things and stuff. And as you know, like when you get into that room and start ranking them based on intentions and trying to move people up and down the list based on fit or what is fit, like, and it got really contentious. So we have a meeting about it. She's ranked so low in some of the rooms. I was like, well, we can rank her higher because we can afford to take the risk. Like, what did you just say? We're like, we can afford to take a risk. She's totally qualified. She can be here. We need diversity in our program. If you're talking about risk,